Okay, good evening. Hello and welcome. Thank you to those that are joining us live and to those that are watching the session on record. I'm pleased to say we're joined this evening by my colleague, Professor Phil Newton. Phil is Director of Learning and Teaching here at the Medical School in Swansea University. And Professor Newton's going to share tonight's topic on the neuroscience of revising. Thank you, Phil. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this latest webinar. I can see we've already had a question about, we're going to talk about medicine neurology. We're going to talk a bit about brains. We're going to focus mostly on the science of learning and in particular the neuroscience of revising. As Emma explained, I'm the Director of Learning and Teaching for the medical school. So I'm responsible for all of the taught programs in the medical school. But my day job is teaching neuroscience to our medical students and to our undergraduate students on our BSc programs, helping them understand how the brain works, helping them understand some of the things that can affect the brain, some of the consequences of it going wrong, and preparing some of our medical students for future careers in medicine, but some of them in neurology as well. And more broadly with our undergraduate students, explaining to them about the neuroscience of learning and memory, which is where we're going to take this evening's content from. I am going to ask you to do a little quiz in a second or two. In order to do that, I'm going to ask you just to put a couple of things in the chat, and I can see that the chat is working, so be prepared just to put your answers in the chat when I ask you a few questions in a second. What we're going to talk about then briefly is two things, really. I'm going to talk very briefly about how we learn. This is a topic we could spend months talking about, and occasionally they let me talk about it for months, but we're just going to do a brief whistle-stop tour of the neuroscience of learning. And in particular, we're going to focus on a couple of key aspects of the way that we learn and the way that our brain works that can be we can use to good effect to improve the way that we study, the way that we revise, the way that we prepare for exams, and the way that we learn a lot of the complex materials that we need to learn in university. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do a very quick exercise. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out a list of words. All right, I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm just going to read them out. And what I want you to do is just try and remember the words as I read them out. Okay, don't write anything down, just listen to me talking, and what you're doing is trying to remember the words. And then once I've read that list out, I'm then going to ask you about some additional words. I'm going to give you some further words on the screen, and I'm going to ask you if the words on the screen were in the list that I read out. Okay, so it's not a summative exam. It's not part of any admissions process. It's just a little quiz to illustrate the key points that I want to make later on. So I'll read out a list of words, just listen to me. Then words will appear on the screen, and I'm just going to ask you yes or no. Was the word on the screen in the list that I read out? If you think that it was, put a yes in the chat. If you think that it's not, put a no in the chat. You don't have to put your answer in the chat. You can just play along at home if you want. Okay, so I'm going to turn myself off, and I'm going to read out the words. Okay, so the words are as follows: smooth, bumpy, road, tough, sandpaper, jagged, ready, coarse, uneven, riders, rugged, sand, boards, ground, and grave. All right, so that's the list of words. Let me bring up the chat so I can see your answers if you're happy to share them with us. Okay, so was the word Swansea on the list of words that I read out? That's nopes all round. Full list of no. Okay, well done, it wasn't. Was the word gravel on the list of words that I read out? Some yeses and some nos. Okay, that's really good. Was the word coarse on the list of words that I read out? Mostly yeses and the odd no. What about the word magic? Was that on the list of words that I read out? A flat panel of no's. What about the word rough? Was that on the list of words that I read out? A sea of yeses with one no from Tommy. Okay, it's worked beautifully, right? And it illustrated the key points that I want to get across. The word rough was not on the list. Okay, and what we've just done is a simplified version of an experiment that's been done many, many times over many, many years. This was a version from 1999 where people were read out a list of words and then they were asked whether, they'd just done exactly what we just did. They were asked whether some additional words were on the list that was read out. And when people were asked, was the word rough on the list that I just read out, 83% of the people in this experiment said yes. Okay, and when people were asked just to write down the list without any prompting, just write from memory the list that was read out to you, more than half of them put the word rough down, even though it wasn't on the list. Okay, and that illustrates some really important principles about the biology of learning and memory. So here's your list. Have a quick look. You can see that the word tough is on there. And you can see that there's lots of words that have meanings that are similar to rough, or which we would consider to be part of the same broad category of meaning as the word rough, but the word rough itself is not there. And what you've done in that little exercise is you've used two different types of memory. Okay, so if I were to ask you, what do these words mean? You'd be able to tell me what they all mean. If I asked you to use them in a sentence, you'd be able to use them all in a sentence. You'd be able to think of synonyms and antonyms, and you'd have all sorts of complex linguistic understanding of what these words mean. And that is an amazing thing that you can do. However, when I ask you just to hold the list of words in your mind for a few seconds after I've read them out, you can't do it. I couldn't do it. Almost everybody couldn't do it. All right, and that's because we're using a different type of memory when we try and do that task. So if I ask you, what does the word rugged mean? Or what does the word riders or gravel mean? And could you use them in a sentence? You're using your long-term memory. Okay, you're fishing out of your memory something that you've already learned and you're able to apply it in the way that I've asked you. When I'm asking you to hold on to that list of words in your mind for a few seconds, you're using working memory. And long-term memory is amazing. And working memory is hopeless. And problems with working memory that we all have are part of the key to evidence-based tips and strategies for teaching, but also for studying and revising. So let me turn myself off for a second. And let me talk you through the basics of the biology of learning and memory. And this might be something you've already covered in your A-levels or in your IB or some other form of study that you're doing, but it's going to revise it and expand a bit upon the neuroscience of it. So there's three major types of memory that we need to be aware of for the purposes of explaining this activity. Short-term memory at the top here. We get information into short-term memory, which is really just sensory processing through the process of encoding. That's what the neuroscientists and the psychologists would call it. So your eyes are processing light, your ears are processing sound waves, they're turning them into the activity of brain cells, of neurons. When we pay attention to something, it then goes from our short-term memory into our working memory. And we have a huge capacity for sensory processing. You're processing sensory information all the time, most of which you're not even aware of. So you wouldn't remember 5 minutes after we'd finished this presentation that my slides had green background with blue text on in those boxes. But now that I've drawn your attention to it, it's gone into working memory. And working memory is where information goes while we try to work out what to do with it. Now, what working memory does, because it's not very good, is it asks long-term memory for a bit of help. When information goes into working memory, when we pay attention to something, what we do is we try and match it with stuff that we have already learned, with stuff that looks similar. So when we're learning something, working memory has a look into long-term memory and says, have we seen something like this before? Where have we seen this before? What did it look like? How did we feel when we saw it? And that memory gets retrieved from long-term memory into working memory. And if we do that process enough times, then the result is that we learn something and it goes into our long-term memory. And learning is obviously what we're trying to achieve, and retrieval is an essential part of that. And retrieval is, in many ways, long-term memory's way of trying to help out working memory, because working memory cannot hold on to information for any length of time, and it can't hold on to a great deal of information. So a big part of learning then a big part of our everyday making sense of the world is we're processing new information all the time, and we're trying to make sense of it in the context of what we already know. Okay, and that process applies whether we're trying to learn chemical structures, the names of anatomical structures, biology and chemistry. It also applies if we're learning complex skills. It applies to learning how to examine a patient, how to listen to their heart, how to do a neurological exam, and all sorts of other things that we want to learn at university. It's easier for me to demonstrate with lists of words than it is with complex practical skills. So long-term memory then lives in a region of the brain called the hippocampus. And long-term memory is really our storage. The neuroscientists get quite upset when we use computing analogies to talk about the brain, but the long-term memory is really like our hard drive. It's where our memories are stored. And they live in this amazing part of the brain, this deep part of the brain, on the left and right-hand side of our brainstem, highlighted in red here, called the hippocampus. And you can see it here. And looking side on at our brain. So this is looking side on. The eyes would be on the far left of the slide, and then the back of the head would be on the right-hand side of the image on the left. And you can see this structure curling round our brainstem here in red. And then on the picture on the right, we're looking at the back of the brain, and you can see, again, this structure, it's left and right hippocampus curling round. It's called the hippocampus because the people that first discovered it thought that it looked like a seahorse. Other people think it looks like the horns of a mountain goat. Either way, it is an amazing piece of kit that we all have. What goes on in the hippocampus is long-term memory. So that is crudely our hard drive. That's where we store our facts and our experiences, our memory of those facts. It's where, if I ask you when your birthday is, you can tell me when your birthday was, the date, you can tell me what a birthday is, and you can tell me about a birthday that you have had. All of those things come from your hippocampus. It also tells you where you are in the space. It tells you you've got a mental map of the world in your hippocampus, and different brain cells, different neurons in your hippocampus are active when we were in different parts of the world. So I have cells in my hippocampus that are active right now, which are telling the rest of my brain that I am sat in my office at home on my desk chair talking to you. It's called spatial memory. Hippocampus is unfortunately, it's one of the first brain regions to suffer in people with Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease is characterized by the steady loss of brain cells from different regions of the brain, but the hippocampus is one of the first regions to be infected. And that's why people with Alzheimer's disease display this memory loss. It's also a site where new cells are constantly born throughout our life. Lots of them when we're younger. It slows down as we get a bit older, but certainly this process called neurogenesis carries on throughout our life and is an important part of allowing us to lay down new memories. And it's where we retrieve memories from. It has a huge capacity. It is a tank. It's very resistant to damage because it's deep within our brain. Alzheimer's and some viral diseases will do damage to it, but it's otherwise pretty resilient. And we've never been able to measure the capacity of the hippocampus in terms of memory storage because it is so big. So what happens then when I ask you to try and remember this list of words is that the hippocampus fills in for the limitations of a second type of memory. So when I ask you to try and remember this list of words, what happens actually is that your working memory reaches into your hippocampus and it pulls out what it thinks is the list of words from memory rather than actually holding the precise list in your head. And of course, when you do something like that, all of these words have similar meanings. They're related to each other in some way. And so what happens is we pull out that list of words, but we pull out words that are also related. We pull out a memory of this general concept of rough or gravel or uneven or whatever it might be. And so we've pulled out the word rough as well as the words coarse and gravel, which were actually in the list. Okay, let me just pause for a second and just check the questions. Why is there a gap between right and left in the hippocampus? Okay, that's a really good question. So the hippocampus, most of our brain structures, we have a left and right. Okay, we have almost all of the brain structures that are modern in evolutionary terms exist in both on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. We're not entirely sure why that is. Most of the left and right sides are connected, although the diagram I showed you doesn't show the connection very well. It's a structure called the fornix that connects the left and right hippocampus. And in many cases, one side of our brain will be dominant over the other for certain types of behavior. So for language, for example, for most of us, it's our left-hand side that dominates over our right-hand side. And so people who have, say, a stroke or some other trauma to their head that damages the left speech center will have more profound effects on their speech than people who have damage to the same part of the brain, but on the right-hand side. That doesn't mean you're left-brained or right-brained. It's a common misapplication of that sort of neuroscience to say that some people are left-brained and some people are right-brained, but there is a distinction between the two. Can you ever exceed the capacity of the hippocampus? I don't think so. That's another really good question. I don't think anyone has ever been able to map the full capacity of the hippocampus, in part because everything that needs to get into the hippocampus needs to come through this second region that we're about to talk about, the prefrontal cortex. And does hippocampus get affected during Alzheimer's? Yes, that's another really good question. It is one of the first regions to go during Alzheimer's, as we said a little bit earlier. Another region that's really that's often affected in Alzheimer's is the one that we're about to talk about. So we're going to move from long-term memory to talking about working memory. Okay, working memory lives mostly in a part of the brain right at the front here. And this image shows you looking at a cartoon of the head from the front, obviously with the eye sockets in the mouth here. The red area highlights the region that's called the prefrontal cortex. It's right here. Every time you head a football, you're banging that into the front of your skull. It's a large region, but there's a particular part of it to the left-hand side and the right-hand side on the just about here on the front of our frontal cortex, called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So it's up towards the top a little bit, it's out at the sides, and it's part of this prefrontal cortex. And this is where working memory lives. Okay, so the other part of the memory that we talked about, the bit that's got a very limited capacity. It also does all sorts of amazing and very human things like abstract reasoning, our ability to be aware of our own thinking. Metacognition lives, we think, in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And things like our capacity for morality are associated with activity in this region. It's an important part of regulating attention, and it has a lot of very intense conversations with our hippocampus. So part of getting memories into our hippocampus involves them passing through the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And then when we do this process of retrieval, what we're doing is we're fishing memories out of our hippocampus and bringing them back into our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to assemble them there. And that's where we're consciously aware of them. Working memory, as I said, is tiny. It's absolutely hopeless. And this is true of all of us, or almost all of us. 99.99% of us have very limited working memory capacity. It's believed to be between 4 to 7 chunks of information that we can hold in our working memory at any one time. Now, what a chunk means is open to interpretation, has been the subject of a lot of study. But it's true, as I said, of almost all of us, that we have this very limited capacity. And then there are many conditions where working memory function is affected negatively in one way or another. It doesn't have to be very severely affected in order for that to have an impact on our daily lives. And many of us will have had working memory tests as part of diagnoses and explorations for different conditions from childhood all the way through to old age. Working memory also is lost early on in Alzheimer's, and because it's so limited to start with, the consequences of the loss of function of working memory are quite profound. So there's another question, people who have high IQ and they have very good memory, why is that? What kind of memory do they have? Okay, so that's a fantastic question that we could spend 6 months answering, and we probably wouldn't get all the way to the answer. It's a question that we cover in one of the third-year neuroscience modules that's new for this year that I do most of the teaching on. And how can I summarize it simply? Having a good memory is not a simple unitary construct. It's not a single thing. There's lots of things that go into the appearance of having a good memory. Practice is a lot of it. Having a good memory to start with is important, but that involves being able to pay attention to things, being able to screen out distractions and so on. Some of the things I'll talk about in a second. And then IQ is a slightly different thing again. And there's lots of complications with the history of IQ. It is a way of measuring lots of different cognitive functions, one of which is working memory and related things like processing speed. It's not the same as having a good memory, having a high IQ, and it's also not necessarily the same as being smart. But having a high IQ does often involve having good working memory. Okay, so this is the sort of thing I could talk about for days on end. So I'm conscious I don't want to keep you beyond the time we've got, and certainly don't want to keep you beyond the kickoff for Swansea City. So let me go on to the practical applications of this biology. So the two things that I want you to take away, the two most useful tips that I can give you, are based upon two core principles: that working memory is no good, but that retrieval helps us match new knowledge to existing. And how we make sense of the world is working memory does its best, but it needs help from long-term memory. And what long-term memory does is it sends information up into working memory to help it make sense of the world. And if we can drive that process, that can help us learn almost anything. The question, how come when you bump your head, you can sometimes temporarily lose your memory? That's a really good question that even though we've known for millennia that this happens, we don't have a really good answer to. This idea of transient amnesia, when some people have a bang on the head and they can, for a brief but alarming period of time, not be able to make new memories and not be able to remember anything that they previously knew, is something that happens for lots of people when they get a bang on the head, but we don't really know why. All we know is that thankfully in the vast majority of cases, it relieves itself and gets back to normal quite quickly. Okay, so the key thing to take away if you want some help with studying and applying the principles of the neuroscience of learning and memory to studying for A-levels, for international bac, for whatever it is you're doing, and also for studying at university, is to do whatever you can to drive this process of retrieval. And there's a study technique that is the one that we recommend to anyone and everyone. It's one of the most powerful study techniques that we know of. It's got the strongest evidence base, and it's called retrieval practice because it's based upon this biology. And it draws upon this phenomenon that we call the testing effect. And the basic principle of the testing effect is that the more tests you take, the better you learn. Okay, and that's the core principle then of retrieval practice, taking tests. I'll answer this question in a second, just before I reassure people who may be alarmed at the thought that a good way to learn is to sit loads of exams. It doesn't have to be an exam. It can be a quiz, or it can be any one of a similar number of activities that maybe aren't formal tests, but take advantage of this same principle of driving information out of long-term memory into working memory, where it can cling on to the new knowledge that we're trying to put into long-term memory. Question, how is your memory affected when you lose consciousness? That often depends why you've lost consciousness and how long you've lost consciousness for. Certain people will lose consciousness if they become intoxicated with alcohol, for example, and they may experience blackouts. And what's happening there is that alcohol is shutting down the basic functioning of sets of neurons in our brain that are important for laying down new memories. And when the different molecular receptors on those neurons are shut down by alcohol, then they don't work very well, and we simply don't have a memory. Where we lose consciousness through getting a bang on the head, that may be a transient loss of memory, but again, the process will be the same. And part of what consciousness is all about is being able, unconsciousness is almost defined by not being able to remember what happened. So when we're asleep, we're not unconscious, we're asleep. When we're under general anesthesia, we're unconscious and we're unable to make new memories when we do that. We don't know even how general anesthetics work. There's lots of good theories about how they work, but even though they have also been around for many hundreds of years, we don't have a conclusive answer about the pure biology of what they actually do to our nervous system. Okay, so we know that working memory is very limited. We know that when we have information in our working memory, the best thing we can do is to bring the relevant information that looks like it up from our long-term memory, the stickiest information, and that's our best chance of capturing the stuff that's hanging about briefly in our working memory and committing it to long-term memory, committing it to actually having learned it. The way we can do that is we can take tests, we can also take quizzes. Helpfully, we can also write quizzes, and that will do exactly the same thing. In fact, it may even work better. So if you're trying to study for, I don't know, biology A-level, or trying to study for a year one module as an undergraduate student, and you can't find practice tests online, or you haven't been given a practice test to do, write some of your own. And the process of writing practice questions and then getting your friends or your peers or colleagues to answer them for you and give you feedback on them is a really, really powerful way of helping you make sure you understand the content and then committing it to memory. Flashcards are a very common technique. It's very common in medicine. It's very common in university study generally. You write something on a card, a question on one side, you write the answer on the other, then you can practice with each other. It's a similar sort of thing. Simply writing down everything you know about a topic ahead of trying of a study session, before you start revising, before you start a class even. Spend 2 minutes just writing down what you know about something. That will help bring to mind all of the relevant information that you already know and make it far more likely that new information as it comes in will stick in the right place. There's a technique that psychologists call elaboration. That's if you're revising with a friend, or even revising on your own, and you ask yourself, why do I know something? Test each other to explain something. You might know the right answer to a question, but why is it the right answer? That will take you to an even higher level of learning. This works with all types of learning, not just factual information, but it's easy to demonstrate with factual information, and the more you do it, the better it is. And we have a question: when writing tests, should it be completely from memory, or can we use notes? That's another really good question. So if you're writing practice tests yourself, okay, that's not a question I'd ever really contemplated in the way you've asked it, but it actually is a really good one. It's okay. It's fine to have your notes. It's fine to have the textbook. What you're doing, as long as you're writing a question and giving yourself, let's say you're writing a multiple choice question, you're giving 5 answer options and making sure they're all plausible, and you are confident that you've got the right one, you know what the right one is, and you give that to a friend or family member to take that question. If you've got it right, you will have taken advantage of this process that we're talking about. Good question. Okay. The history of this approach is quite interesting. Lots of the literature compares taking practice tests or quizzes to what the literature the researchers call restudying. And why do they compare it to restudying? Because every time students at any level get surveyed about what their study habits are, what they say is they reread notes, or they might take a textbook and they might highlight or underline, or they might make notes in the margins. And there is some value to doing that, and it's better to do that than to do nothing at all. But every time this process of restudying, rereading, or highlighting or underlining, every time that gets compared to taking practice tests, writing tests wins out as a more effective study strategy. This works out in the lab, so it's been done many, many hundreds of times now in different laboratory settings. It's also been done in what we call authentic settings, so university curricula and schools, where students are asked to take extra practice tests or to write tests or to do any of those other activities we talked about. The students do better. They do better with practice tests and some of the other things than if we ask them to do things like mind maps. That is an effective study strategy, but it's not as effective as taking practice tests or writing tests or making flashcards. This sort of approach also enhances what we call transfer. So if you're learning about a particular topic, let's say you're learning about a principle from, I don't know, psychology, and you're learning about the application of that principle in a particular setting. Let's say you're learning about classical conditioning and the placebo effect, and you're learning about that in the context of analgesia, so placebo analgesia, where people experience pain relief from taking what are called dummy or sugar pills. If you've learned the biology of that using retrieval practice by testing yourself on it as you go along, then you're better able to transfer your understanding to a completely different context. So the application of the biology of the placebo effect to the treatment of Parkinson's disease, for example. This is what we call transfer. It's a really important part of higher order learning. It's a really important part of university learning. It's enhanced by retrieval practice. And it works with preschool children, and it works with people at what's called the university of the third age, people who are drawing their pension at every age, at every subject, at every level. Retrieval practice is effective. Some more questions. Is it better to listen to a podcast about the subject you're revising or to watch a video about it? Now, that depends. In general, and I'll talk about this in a second, pictures are a more effective way of learning something than verbal types of learning, so text-based forms of learning. But it does depend what you're learning, and it depends when and how you're learning it. And we do have preferences for the way in which we prefer to learn things. So for example, if you were driving to work or you were out for a run, you wouldn't want to be watching a video. And a podcast is a far better way of learning under those sorts of circumstances. In general, though, the more ways you can represent the sorts of things that you want to learn, the better it is for you. Although if you find that podcasts really work for you, I wouldn't want to try and dissuade you from doing that. I certainly prepare for lots of my teaching by listening to podcasts on the latest research in the field as I'm out with a dog, and can translate that into my teaching for our students. And another question, why sometimes people forget what they've studied, is that short-term memory. So an additional key to effective studying, which may not actually be in the slides, but I'll mention it now since you asked, is practice. The more that you practice, the more that you engage in these sorts of active forms of learning, the more likely learning is to stick permanently. And there's a related principle that we may feel sometimes like we've forgotten something, but often we haven't. It's just the things that we haven't worked with cognitively for a long time, we often need a little bit of help to retrieve from our long-term memory, to retrieve from our hippocampus. So practice helps, and if it feels like you've forgotten something, maybe you just need a reminder. Okay, so that's lots of strategies to help drive information out of the amazing piece of kit that is our hippocampus. And the final thing I'll just talk about briefly is some strategies to help with alleviating some of the problems that are caused by the weakness or the limitations of this different type of memory. That's our working memory that lives in our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Just before I do that, there's another question. How often do you have to repeat a topic to put it in your long-term memory? Again, that's a really good question with a really complex answer. It depends how complicated it is. It depends how much you already know about it. The best thing you can do, and this is another advantage of retrieval practice that I forgot to mention, is if you've studied something and you think you know it, take some practice tests. If you get the answers right, then there's a good chance you know it. And by taking those or writing those practice tests, you also are giving yourself feedback on how well your learning has progressed and how much you know, and you can compare that to perhaps how much you thought you knew. How come people generally perform better in exams when doing a similar test at home? Does performing under pressure help with retrieval from your long-term memory? Okay, that's another really good question. So stress doesn't do great things to this particular part of the brain that's on the screen right now, our prefrontal cortex. And other regions of our prefrontal cortex are all across the front and down the sides and up underneath our eyes. They are really important regions for lots of our decision making. And our decision making can go wonky when we're under stress. And that's because stress, I'm oversimplifying, but it can shut down or feel like it's shutting down this particular region of the brain. And so that's part of why some people feel like they don't do well in exams under formal settings. Having said that, there's a pretty good set of research that shows this process of retrieval practice actually works best if you take more exams. Now, that's not something that people like to hear because lots of us find exams to be fairly unpleasant. But again, practice makes perfect with taking exams. That's the reason why we have mock exams. And that's the reason why for most of the types of assessment you'll do at university, you always get a chance to practice with that type of assessment, because it helps to alleviate some of that stress and can show you what success looks like in terms of the particular method and the particular method of being assessed. Okay, so working memory, all of us, lives around about here. It's no good. Some tips then for giving working memory the best chance at processing that information and getting it into your long-term memory as soon as it can. Now, some of this is going to be things I know we get told, but it really is powerful stuff when we apply it properly. We don't have a lot of space in our working memory to process new information. And if we fill up that space with things that are distracting, then we haven't got space for the things that we're trying to learn. And that includes obvious things like Twitter and Facebook, or whatever the TikTok, whatever the current favorite social media platform is, the radio, the TV, our gaming console. Having those distractors really doesn't work well with the limited capacity we have in our working memory. Anything you can do to stop your working memory having to do unnecessary mental work is a really good thing. How many hours do you think we need to spend on studying is another question we've had. Again, it depends enormously on what it is you're studying, why you're studying it, what you hope to do with that knowledge, and how much you already know. The more practice tests you take, the better you'll be able to tell yourself, do I know to the level that I need, the things that I need to know? And the more reassurance you can give yourself about whether you're in the place that you need to be. A couple of final tips then. Again, this is now more from the cognitive psychology literature than perhaps the neuroscience literature, but it's an effective strategy nevertheless. The evidence tells us, advises us very strongly to use spaced practice. And what that means in plain language is don't study the same thing for a long period of time. Okay, so rather than studying, let's say, biology for, I don't know, a whole day, break it up into little chunks. And what do you do in the spaces between the chunks? If you can, don't study blocks of things next to each other. Study the same amount of things for the same amount of time, but break it down into smaller chunks. And that's a process that's called interleaving. And interleaving and space practice work together to form a more effective study strategy than the things that we might be used to, which is sitting down with the biology notes for a day and studying biology all day. So we've had a question, how many hours do we need to spend on each subject? That's a really good question that I think hasn't been conclusively answered. So we know that long blocks of something are bad. And we know that cramming a subject is really, really bad if you want to commit things to long-term memory. But how long should you study a particular topic for? And how much space should you leave, or time should you leave before you study it again? The fine, precise details of that, I would say, probably vary a lot by individual. But if you've studied on for a particular topic in, say, biology for half an hour or an hour, and you finding yourself becoming much more distracted or drifting off, staring out the window, checking social media, rather than checking social media, rather than switching to something that's not helpful, switch to studying something different. You might have set aside the afternoon for biology, but if you do an hour of biology, an hour of chemistry, and an hour of maths in an afternoon, you're probably going to be in better shape than if you spent 3 hours studying biology. Okay. And the final thing then is this principle that we call dual coding. And this is where people have looked into that tiny little window that we have in our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, our working memory. Even though it's got a really limited capacity, we can split that capacity into two. Now, the precise details of this vary depending upon which textbook you're reading and whose advice you're taking, but it does appear to be consistent that there are two separate channels of processing that can happen in our working memory. And very simplistically, those can be split into words and verbal types of learning and pictures. And if we are, whatever it is we're learning, if we can try and make a mental representation of it in both of those formats, then learning is better, because it takes advantage of the fact that we've got these two separate, even though they're small, these two separate capacities in our working memory. So if you're studying something that's in text form, try drawing a picture of it. If you're studying, I don't know, you're trying to understand the structure of the heart as part of a biology lesson, write out a text description of what it looks like, as well as studying the visual image of it. And you will have made two different mental representations that can then live in your hippocampus and you can retrieve when it comes to the assessment. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying the neuroscience and the biology of this, but it works. From a behavioral perspective, if you can make two different representations of the learning that you're trying to do, you will learn more effectively. The question, what specific revision activities do you recommend? I'll come to that on my final slide with some final recommendations for tips and tricks for studying. So this is just a tip, what I've just said. If you can draw pictures of words, not pictures of words, but if it's something that you've learned in text form, try drawing a picture of it. If you've learned something in picture form, try writing a text summary of it. And there is also a further bit of evidence from psychology about what's called the picture superiority effect, which suggests that pictures of the two, pictures are probably a better way of trying to learn something. So always try and draw things out if you can, he said in front of a slide full of text. Okay, so a summary of the things that we've covered this evening then. Our long-term memory is amazing. Our hippocampus is amazing. All of the other bits of our brain that are wired into our hippocampus are amazing. We can store, to use a crude analogy, a huge amount of learning in our hippocampus. But in order to get it there, most of the things that we try to learn have to go through our working memory. And for all of us, our working memory is not very good. So there are things that we can do to try and help out our working memory. Taking quizzes and writing quizzes are probably the things that I would recommend above all others. And so that gets to that question at the top there. What specific revision activities would you recommend? I'd recommend writing some practice quiz questions. And there are apps that you can use to write these things, like Kahoot, where you can get a free account, share the questions amongst your friends and your peers, or even just writing them out on a piece of paper, setting them aside for a few days and coming back to them and trying to answer them can be a really effective way of studying. And then just avoid trying to overload your poor old working memory and your poor old dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Space out your learning. Try and interleave different subjects when you're studying. Try and avoid distractors, and above all, make sure you get sleep, because one of the other things that really isn't good for any of these processes, but in particular for our prefrontal cortex, is a lack of sleep. That really does put us at a disadvantage when we're trying to learn. And so whatever you can do to get good sleep is helpful for all sorts of elements of our life, but in particular when studying for exams. Okay, we'll share these. I'll just turn myself off for a second so that in the recording you've got a link to some of the research papers that inform some of the teaching that we do in the modules where we cover this content, and when we're giving our students some study strategy activities. All of these papers are available via Google Scholar. And there are many more besides, and then I will answer some of your questions. So it's probably best if I stop sharing. Is that a good idea, Emma? And then we can answer the questions.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you. So I'm just going to end the recording. And before I do that, just to say thank you so much to Professor Newton for joining us this evening on such an informative topic. Those that are watching this on record, if you do have specific questions, then as Professor Newton said, please email us, and the address is study@swansea.ac.uk.